Right, Genesis chapter 47, we're going to be studying tonight. Got some new contacts last week. My prescription changed, and I can see better far away, but closer is worse. So I might have to use my cheaters here tonight. It was so bad when I stood up here, I went back and got them. So we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 47, studying the story of Joseph. And of course, last week we studied mainly about the number of people that went down into Egypt, and that was kind of a side study. Some people told me they really enjoyed it. Some others told me, I don't have a clue what you were talking about. So it's one of those things, I wouldn't want to do it every week, have a study like that, but I think it's sometimes necessary for us to kind of go into the deeper things of the Bible rather than just stay shallow all the time, just take things on their face value. So tonight, we're not going to have the deep study. We're going to be back in Genesis 47, just kind of going over the story and talking a little bit. That number, that promise is going to come into effect. We'll talk a little bit about why it's so important, why the Bible even, record the number of people that went down into Egypt. But let's talk about our discussion question number one on your handout. What kind of promises do people tend to not take seriously?
Most of them.
Well, in today's world, unfortunately, that's probably true. A lot of people, you used to, when you told somebody something, you could count on them. But a lot of people today, I don't take much what people in the world tell me. Sometimes they're trustworthy people. Sometimes you can count on them. Sometimes you can't. What else? Anything else come to mind? Do you think we count some promises more important than others? Yeah. Okay. So which one might we consider not that important?
Heat of the moment kind of thing. In the heat of the moment, promises.
Yeah, I think sometimes in the heat of a moment, we can make a promise or somebody can make us a promise and you kind of stop and you look back on it and you say, well, why did I promise that? They probably knew I wasn't going to do it anyway, so no big deal if I don't keep it. I think sometimes we have a tendency though to view things or promises, we kind of put them in two different categories. You have those small promises and you have those big promises, right? And the big promises are always more important than those small ones that you make. Is that true?
Well, that's tendency.
That's our tendency, right? But think about the promises of God. I mean, when we talk about the promises of God, do we divide those into small promises and big promises? I don't think we have that same tendency when it comes to God's promises. But as human beings, I think again, sometimes we can make promises and really not intend to keep them. I can tell you, as a preacher, I've sat down with a number of people, had some rough things who were going on in their life, and they would say something rash like, I can guarantee you this, if God does this for me, then I'm going to serve him, every day of my life. And you can I don't think I've ever had one of those people keep that promise. I've seen God do what they ask him to do, but I haven't seen them keep their side of the promise. And I think sometimes we get in those situations, we just, in the heat of the moment, we just kind of say these rash things. And when it actually comes to keeping them, it's a little bit different one. What about promises that we make to our family? Do you think those are more important or less important than others? How do you think we treat them?
Well, sometimes we don't treat them the right way.
I would probably say most of the time we don't, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you might tell your children something as small as, I promise we'll go get ice cream tomorrow night. And then tomorrow night comes and, you get busy and you think, well, they understand, no big deal. But again, that's kind of the idea, there's these big promises and there's these small promises. And I think we probably think, well, our family is more understanding than anybody else. And so they, if we don't do that, they'll understand. No big deal. But the Bible has a lot to say about promises, doesn't it? And tonight we're going to study about a promise that Joseph makes to Jacob. And it was a pretty important one, but we'll talk about why that was such an important promise and the meaning of it a little bit later on. All right, so let's talk about Jacob and his family have come into Egypt, and they're getting ready to settle down. So question number 2 on your handout, again, dealing with Genesis chapter 47 tonight. Who did Joseph take to meet Pharaoh?
5 of his brothers.
Yeah, 5 of his brothers. Why do you think he only took 5? He had 11, right?
Probably afraid to take them all.
Might be afraid to take them all? Okay, that could be.
I was sort of thought he cherry picked. I don't know that, but
I mean, Joseph was a pretty sharp guy, wasn't he? And when it came to human nature and discerning people, he was really good at it. And so the Bible doesn't just come out and tell us, this is why he took only 5 and this is why he took these 5 and not the other 6. But I imagine he knew Pharaoh well enough and he knew his brothers well enough. Hey, these guys will hit it off good. These guys will have stuff in common. They'll have conversation and it'll be a pleasant meeting. And certainly didn't want to mess it up, did it? Didn't want to start out by making Pharaoh mad or, one of the brothers saying something they should have kept their mouth shut or something like that. So I think he probably would have known his brothers well enough by this point to know, who would best appease Pharaoh and, again, who would be most compatible when it came to conversation and things like that. So he takes 5 of his brothers to go meet with Pharaoh. Question number 3 here. Why did his brothers tell Pharaoh that they had come to Egypt?
there was no Asher at all.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this in Genesis 46, if you remember kind of at the end. Joseph was pretty careful to brief his family before they met with Pharaoh, wasn't he? And he kind of went over some, I think, customs and things like that. Probably there's a lot more of their conversation, I imagine, than what's just recorded in the scripture. But one of the things that he told them is what it meant to be a shepherd in Egypt before they ever went and met with Pharaoh, right? Why was that important?
They didn't like shepherds either.
Yeah, shepherds weren't well thought of in Egypt. And so they needed to be careful. They weren't going to lie about what they did or anything like that, but they needed to be careful that they didn't say something that could offend Pharaoh or, they probably didn't want to make shepherding the heart of the conversation, I'd say, is basically the gist that Joseph was getting at here.
Sheep people and cattle people will never be able to get along.
No.
And even in our history of our country, they had battles over that. Of course, the cattle people said the sheep ate the grass too low, and it killed the grass out. Cows couldn't get it, and they had all kinds of stuff they went by there. But that's been a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, there's generally been a battle over the pasture land with those two groups. So Joseph, though, again, he'd already told his brothers beforehand about the Egyptians' view of shepherding, but he also told them, don't deny the fact that you're shepherds. Don't stand there before him and lie about why you came here and what you're going to do while you're here. Just tell him this is how it is. We're shepherds. That was been our occupation. That's kind of been our ancestral heritage for a while. We brought all these sheep, and so we need somewhere to pasture.
How far? I didn't look this up. I don't know. Do you know how far Goshen is from where Pharaoh was dwelling here?
No, and that really nobody knows where Goshen is for sure. It's generally thought, it's around the delta of the Nile River, probably in that fertile area, but does it give a...
Now they know where Ramses is.
Yeah, that's where they went. Yeah, that was kind of what we would call the country or the area.
I always thought Joseph's plan there was to give them a little bit of separation, room to grow and expand without being in Pharaoh's business all the time.
Yeah.
That's what if I was Joseph, that's what I'd try and do. Let's
Yeah.
get this good land a little ways away so we're not causing disturbances and we have room to grow.
Yeah. But it also didn't hurt that it was probably the best of the best around there, right? But you are right. It wasn't like in the heart of the Egyptian culture. And so that kind of gave them an area, I think, where they could, not interfere so much in everyday society or be a burden. A lot of people would have despised them and looked down on them, but would have allowed them to do what they've been doing all their life and still not really have any serious repercussions because of it. But again, Joseph had brought those flocks. They brought their sheep. They brought their herds, and they fully indicated to Pharaoh that they intended to live there in Egypt. That was their intention. But when you think about Joseph's brothers here, and again, they were as straightforward and upfront and honest with Pharaoh as they could have been. And that would have went a long way. And I think Pharaoh was a pretty understanding guy. At least he liked Joseph enough that it didn't bother him too much that these guys were shepherds. So question 4 here, we already covered that. Where did Joseph's brothers ask permission to live? Goshen, yeah. They had a lot of flocks and herds. They were in need of a good pasture land. That's probably, again, believed to be in the northern region of Egypt there where, the water from the Nile River would have made that soil really fertile and prosperous and kind of away from Egyptian society too. So kind of a win-win situation there. This is interesting though, whenever they do talk to Pharaoh, question number 5 here, what kind of land did Pharaoh have in mind for Joseph's family?
Best of the land.
Yeah, only the best is what he wanted for him, didn't he? And if you go back, kind of an interesting side note here, but if you turn back to Genesis chapter 45, I think we might have talked a little bit about this while we were there. But about verse 18, here's what Pharaoh says whenever they hear that Joseph's brothers have come to Egypt. He says, "Bring your father and your households and come to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land." If you go down to verse 20, he says, "Also do not be concerned about your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours." So Pharaoh, from the beginning, he had told them, "I'm going to give you the very best that this land has to offer." That was true when it came to their possessions, but it was also true when Pharaoh thought about where are these guys going to live? What kind of land are we going to give them? It wasn't like, well, we'll find the worst spot here in Egypt and they can live there. He said, no, we're going to give them the best that we have. And so Pharaoh was certainly appreciative of Joseph. He was appreciative of all that Joseph had done for him personally. Can you imagine what the people thought of Pharaoh because of Joseph? I mean, they would have been happy that he was in charge and where he was. But it was a small sacrifice. Think about it. You think, well, why would Pharaoh be willing to give up the best land in Egypt to these strangers or these foreigners, these outsiders? But what Pharaoh gave them was very small in comparison with what Joseph did for Egypt. Because Joseph basically, he not only kept Egypt in its position, but he gave tremendous wealth and power to Pharaoh himself, as we're going to read about here a little later on.
Don't you think he was the richest Pharaoh in the history of Egypt?
I would say so. Yeah, by the time the famine gets done, he is, isn't he?
All the money, all the land, all the people serving, he had everything.
He did, didn't he?
Instead of free stuff,
Yeah, that was one group that he left alone, religion, right? But yeah, I mean, he became super prosperous because of Joseph. And so, to give those people that area of land, that wasn't a big deal to him when you own everything. Question number 6 here. What additional request does Pharaoh make of Joseph concerning his own personal livestock?
He requested that they take care of his own stock.
Yeah, he requested that Joseph's brothers take care of his herds as well as taking care of their sheep. And, you know, you think about that, what did that mean for Joseph's brothers? Well, that's a pretty big position, isn't it? Pretty good promotion when you walk into the land, you're a foreigner, and then, you know, minutes later, you're kind of the chief herdman or the chief officials of Pharaoh's herds. But again, why did he do that? Well, I think a couple reasons. First of all, Joseph had been so beneficial to him and to Egypt that he wanted to try to repay the favor as much as he could. But I think it's also this, he probably thought maybe some of that rubbed off on his brothers, what Joseph had. You know, Joseph was a man of honesty and integrity. His work ethic had to be, you know, impeccable. And of course, when it came to just common sense and being in charge of stuff, Joseph was outstanding. And so if his brothers were anything like him, it was a no-brainer to ask them to take care of Pharaoh's cattle. Question number 7 here. Who did Joseph introduce to Pharaoh next?
Jacob.
Yeah, Jacob. And the very first thing that Jacob does is what? That's actually the first thing and the last thing that he does whenever he meets Pharaoh.
Ask him how we were.
Okay, that's one of the questions, but what does Jacob do for Pharaoh? He blesses him.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he blesses him. And what do you think that means?
Sometimes it's translated as saluted, so it's kind of an invitation type of thing.
Yeah, it is. There's several versions that translate it that way. That's actually not the meaning of the original Hebrew word. Well, turn back to Genesis 14 real quick here. This kind of give you the sense of the word. Then we'll try to move on here. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I've got to put my glasses on to read my Bible. So Genesis 14 and verse 19. This is when Abraham, remember, they go and recapture the city of Sodom. Of course, Lot was part of that too. Verse 18, you read about Melchizedek, that king of Salem, the priest of the Most High God. Verse 19, he blessed him, that is, Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And he said, blessed be Abram of God, Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God, Most High, who hath delivered your enemies into your hand. The idea of blessing is something that's, you know, taught throughout the pages of God's Word. And there's generally a principle that is incorporated when it comes to blessing somebody. Hebrew writer talks about this in Hebrews 7 and verse 7, and here's the principle. Now, beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Well, what does that mean when it comes to a blessing?
Can you repeat that?
Beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. What does that tell you when it came to Abraham and Melchizedek? Who was the greater?
Melchizedek is more righteous.
Melchizedek. He was a priest of the Most High God. He blessed Abraham because he was the greater. Okay, the lesser is blessed by the greater. So when you talk about Pharaoh and Jacob meeting, what does it mean that Jacob blessed Pharaoh? He was the greater of the two, right? And that's not the way the world would have viewed it, right? Think about it from the world perspective, and they were looking at these two men. Well, who's the greater of the two? Obviously this guy, right? He's rich, has all these possessions, he's in charge of, you know, this entire nation, but the lesser is always blessed by the greater. And so this is a blessing, obviously. You know, one of the things that God told the descendants of Abraham is, I'm going to bless those who bless you, I'm going to curse those who curse you. Was it a blessing to be around these people? That's right. If you treated them right, yeah. God says, you treat them right, I'll treat you right. And so I think what you have here is this principle that he's he's basically talking about this blessing, may God bless you. You blessed us. You treated us more than fairly. You taken care of my son, Joseph. The blessing of the Lord is going to be upon you because of that. That's an interesting principle when you go throughout the Old Testament, that promise that God made to him. I'll bless those who bless you. And if you treated them right, you did get a blessing from God. Treated them wrong, you got the curse, didn't you? But that principle is well illustrated throughout the scripture. All right, so where are we now? Question number 8 here. This is Laney's question. What was the very first question that Pharaoh had for Jacob? There you go. That's what everybody says when they meet Dennis. How old are you? I'm just kidding, Dennis. I like to give you a little grief every now and then.
They usually say it a little loud.
Oh, yeah, so you can hear it. Oh.
Read 2 Timothy.
Can't even remember.
We wouldn't tease you if we don't like you, brother. I think that's when you know you're old. when you meet somebody and the very first question out of their mouth is, how old are you? How old was Jacob? 130 years old. He's getting up there. And I imagine to Pharaoh, he was like an ancient dude, I can think back to when I was younger and, I thought a person was 50, 60 years old. That's like next to Methuselah, But you get that age and you look back and you think, well, that's not that old. But he probably looked pretty old in the eyes of Pharaoh. Question 9, we already answered that. How old was he when he stood before Pharaoh? 130 years old. His lifespan, even though, that's pretty good age at that point in time, his lifespan didn't match that of his father, Isaac. Isaac lived to be 180 years old. And then his grandfather, Abraham, lived to be 175. So, he was old, but there were people who lived a lot longer than he had in the not too distant past. But Pharaoh must have been struck by at least his appearance when it looked about his age. Jacob talks a little bit, though, question 10, about his time here upon the earth. How did he view the time that he'd spent upon this earth? Again, 130 years that he'd been living here upon this earth. How do you view his life?
Human evil.
Yeah, I think there's really 3 key words there. Those are 2 of them that he uses to kind of describe his years here upon this earth. But the first one that really pops to me is the pilgrimage word. Did you notice that? He said, my pilgrimage, that's the noun word of what we would translate sojourn. And it's one of those ideas, talk about it in Hebrews chapter 11. How did these guys view their time here on earth?
Passing for.
Yeah, we're not staying here. We're just visiting for a while. We're just sojourners. We're just pilgrims, so to speak. But you think about Jacob's life, that was really his life. Now, he did have some pretty good possessions, a good amount, I should say, of possessions. But as far as owning any land, did he own any land? No. He never really stayed in one place permanently either. He just kind of like Abraham, he just kind of moved along here and there and never really had a place where they, put down stakes and says, this belongs to me, this is my home. And so imagine like a lot of those people that day, they paid the people who possessed the land to graze their herds on, graze their flocks. But he never really looked at a place, I think, here upon this earth and said, well, that's home for me. Another interesting thing, well, what does Hebrews 11 tell us they were looking for? Better city, better foundations, the city where God was the builder. And so that's an important way to view our life, is we're not here permanently, we're just making a temporary stop. Where we're really headed is our home, and that home is heaven. And that's where our eyes should always be focused. And so that allowed him to live a very nomadic lifestyle without really being displeased.
The pilgrimage part, I agree completely, but the few and evil has stood out to me in the past. It almost sounds like you got the glass half empty and the glass half full kind of guy. It sounds like the glass half empty kind of guy here. If you look at his life, okay, he didn't own land, he had a huge family. You know what I'm saying? Now they're in the good graces of Pharaoh and they had the best land on the earth at the time,
Yeah.
It seems sort of pessimistic to me, his response to that. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think there's a few key events in his life that kind of probably made him feel that way. But the way to describe it, first of all, as few, I mean, how would we describe our life? How's your time here on earth?
Quick.
Goes by fast, doesn't it? I mean, you look back on your life and you say, man, I do, almost 50 years, where'd it go? Like yesterday, you were a kid, things were happening, but doesn't matter how long you live. 130 years, that sounds like forever, doesn't it? But that's the way I think we as humans always view our life. Our years here are few. Life is very short. It's a brief, temporary thing here. And Pharaoh, looking at Jacob, he probably didn't think it was brief or temporary, but it was. Kind of like that young child who looks at the 50 or the 60-year-old. Adam mentioned the idea of evil. What does that mean? Doesn't imply wickedness, does it? What does it mean?
Trouble.
Yeah, trouble. Full of misery. Full of distress. And I think you look at his life, there are some key happenings in his life why I think he would look back on it and say, it's not been the greatest. Been some pretty miserable time. The first one that really stands out to me is when he has to run away from home because of his brother. I mean, we've talked about it before, but Esau, he wasn't just spouting words. He was going to kill him. And so that made him have to leave his home. He had to leave his mother, had to leave his father behind. Had to go live in a foreign land with his uncle Laban. How'd that go? He cheated him time and time again, right? Jacob says at the end, he can't even count a number of times.
But God blessed him in spite of that.
He did.
As a rich man.
He did, but part of the reason he left was because of Laban's deception. He finally got fed up with it and said, listen, as long as we're here, we're not going to be what we can be. We got to get out of here. And, of course, he ends up marrying Rachel, and Leah loved Rachel, loved his life. What happened to her? She died in childbirth, didn't she? When you think about his sons, you think his sons ever gave him any grief? Well, they murdered an entire town. Remember that? Jacob was afraid that the Canaanites were going to turn on him and attack him because of what their sons did. Talked about growing up with Joseph. They weren't the best of fellows. They didn't always do the right things, and I imagine there was a lot of grief that they caused in his life too. And then I think the icing on the cake was what he believed happened to Joseph. For almost 20 years, this son that he loved so much, he thought he was dead. And so I look at those things and I look back on his life and I think, yeah, he probably was miserable. There probably was a lot of misery in his life. Some of it was probably self-inflicted, but like you said, there are a lot of blessings that God poured out upon him. But probably the best part of his life is going to be the last 17 years here that he gets to spend in Egypt before he dies. But that's the way that he viewed his time here upon this earth. All right, let's talk about Joseph's interaction and dealing with the famine. Question 11, what happened when people in both Egypt and Canaan ran out of money? For years, money worked, right, to come and to buy grain, but eventually, guess what happened to all the money? Or guess who had it all? Pharaoh did, right? Everybody had to go there and buy food, and eventually they ran out of money, didn't have any more money. And so what happened when that took place? Yeah, the first thing they started doing was trading their livestock. You know, they came to Joseph and they said, you know, we don't have any money. Nobody has any money, but what we do have is livestock. We've got animals. And so will you take our horses, you know, for corn, or will you take our donkeys or our cattle or sheep or whatever? Will you take these in trade for food? And that went on for a while.
That means that Pharaoh put Joseph's brother in charge of all the livestock in the land of Egypt.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah, it grew by the minute, I think, don't you? But that was kind of a blessing too, because what would have happened to all these livestock? They'd die. I mean, these people didn't have money to take care of themselves. They sure didn't have money to take care of their animals. And so when they turned them over to Pharaoh, at least Pharaoh had the goods and the sources, you know, to take care of these animals, and at the same time to allow these people to live. So what happened when that ran out? Everybody traded in all their animals, didn't have animals anymore. Yeah, two things. The first thing is, they said, only thing we got left, you know this, Joseph, you know, you got all our money, you got all our animals. Well, the only thing we got left is our land and ourselves. And so they basically notice that Joseph doesn't lay this out before them. They come to Joseph with this proposition. And the proposition is, you know, we'll sell ourselves into the hand of Pharaoh, we'll become his servants, and we'll sell our lands in exchange for food. And that's what happened. So eventually, Pharaoh winds up with all the money. I mean, he winds up with all the animals, he winds up with all the land, he winds up with all the people. And so one of the most powerful figures, probably in world history, if you really think about it. Whose land did Joseph buy for Pharaoh? That's not the right question. Whose land didn't Joseph buy for Pharaoh? It should be the question there. Question 12. Yeah, the priest. The only land that didn't get bought was the land that belonged to the priest. And why did it not get bought?
he gave them a portion of goods.
Yeah, Pharaoh took care of them, right? They were paid by Pharaoh himself. So Pharaoh had money, Pharaoh had livestock, he had everything they need to pay for them, and so they didn't need to sell their land in order to have food.
It's kind of like they come up with the idea of sharecropping here.
Yeah, well, and this is kind of, you know, you think about Joseph. Again, Joseph was a pretty smart guy. So, you know, if Pharaoh winds up with all this land and all the people belong to him, how you gonna take care of it? Well, you gotta pay them somehow, don't you? You gotta give them food, you gotta, you know, provide them with somewhere to live, you gotta take care of them, things like that.
And as you read, I think Joseph was more than fair, because they were paying a less tax rate than we do.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what I'm saying? When you add up the property taxes and the
Yeah.
personal taxes and the income taxes and the sales taxes, we're paying a higher percent than they were.
And the people here were sharecropping in Arkansas, in Mississippi, they didn't get that much.
Yeah. Yeah, but that was a law, you know, that Joseph established, and basically he provided the seed. I mean, he gave them the things that they needed to plant. He said, you guys go out here and you work the land, and you get 4/5 of that harvest. Okay, whatever you can raise, whatever you can grow, you'll get 4/5 of it, but 1/5 of it goes to Pharaoh. That's his tax. Well, what does that do if you're out there working? That's the motivation, isn't it? I want to do the best as I can. I want to grow as many crops as I can. I want to do the best I can. I want to work hard, because that means more money in my pocket. But it also meant more money in Pharaoh's pocket at the same time. So it was a more than a fair system. And at the same time, it allowed the people to survive. Joseph said, you go have food for yourselves, for your children, not going to have to worry about anything. And so that's eventually what happened in the land of Egypt. And, you know, who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses, right? So 400 years later, or about, when Moses writes these words, he says this is still happening in the land of Egypt. So it gives you kind of an insight into the situation of the economy whenever the Israelites come up out of the land of Egypt.
But wasn't this only in the land of the priest, I mean, that was what finally kept that, the priest of Egyptian, idolatry or.
It wouldn't have been all the different nations and gods, would it? But yeah, only Egyptians priests, I imagine. I think that's probably the implication at least. So question 14, what happens to the Israelites while they're in Egypt? Everybody else is starving. Everybody else is barely getting by. Everybody else has, only has 2 cents to rub together. What's happened to Israel? Prospering greatly, aren't they? They're growing. They're growing and growing exponentially, multiplying. Under Joseph's leadership, they had more than adequate provisions. He certainly provided for them. And this is why it's so important, because 70 of these people went down into Egypt. When they come out of Egypt, how many are there? Millions. God's provided this environment for them, and that's what he told Jacob. He said, you go down there into Egypt, and I'll make of you a great nation. And when Jacob did what the Lord told him to do, the Lord kept his promise. The last request of Jacob to Joseph before his death was to take his bones back to the land of Canaan, bury him there. We'll talk a little bit more about that, Lord willing, next week. So, anybody got any thoughts, comments, or anything before we end tonight?